Good evening. Welcome to the Lessons of Vietnam show tonight. This is part two, the Vietnam veterans and the Ken Burns documentary. As I mentioned to you the last show, one of the concerns I have is the documentary being used as the basis for the history of the Vietnam War. It was entertaining to a certain extent, but it sure missed a whole lot and gave a whole lot of misinformation. We've been fighting misinformation now for 50 years or better about the Vietnam War, the myths, and so forth. So we're trying to make our own documentary to a certain extent so that teachers can see this show and compare it with what Ken Burns and Lynn Novick have put in there. We have what's tonight special guest, J Del Vecchio. He's an author. He's a Vietnam veteran Marine. Del was a Marine photographer. He spent a lot of time with the Marines in combat and so forth. He is a historian, and he's also, Del, what was it, Secretary of?
The Vietnam Veterans for Factual History.
Okay. That's a group that's been out there for the years, is trying to correct the myths and so forth about the Vietnam War and the men and women who fought it. And it's been an uphill battle and will continue. If you want to call in tonight, we'd love to have you. The response from viewers is very much desired. The number is 919 518-9773. Sorry about that. I've said it so many times. Or even better, go on Skype, and it's Computers 2K Voice. And come on and ask questions. We had a gentleman last time from Seattle, Washington, who said I was talking too fast, and I was, because I was trying to cover a whole lot of material in a short period of time. And he said he had some questions and so forth. If you're out there, sir, please call us in and ask those questions. I was hoping you would email me so that I could get you on earlier, but it is what it is. So if you are out there tonight, be sure to call in and ask your questions. We'll try to answer them for you. Now, what I'm going to do is start out with was one of the critiques of the thing that we had. Again, it's Skype Computers 2K Voice. We have talked about Vietnam Veterans documentary, and your voice matters. So let us know. And what I'm going to be talking about now is the What Not to Learn from the documentary by Greg Daddis. As y'all have already learned in the past, don't worry about my pronunciation. My southern tongue and my hearing doesn't always work. As the dust settles on the 18-hour documentary, The Vietnam War, it seems unlikely that the long-standing debates engendered by the conflict, I know I can say that word because I was involved in it, conflict will abate much in the film's aftermath. As is so often the case, most reviews, some written even before the first episode of Ken Burns and Lynn Novick's epic aired, reveal more about the reviewer than the film itself. When it comes to the war in Vietnam, there are plenty of hobby horses to mount. That was kind of a subtle, not so subtle, slap in the face to people who were concerned about the documentary rewriting history to start with. But we'll just kind of go on with that as trying to get everybody's voice in there. It will take time for American viewers to process this documentary, on which full disclosure I served as historical advisor. Now that right there, let me read that again to you. On which full disclosure I served as a historical advisor. So you remember, just think about that as we go on. Old wounds are reopened. Passionate, sometimes vulgar voices are transposed on top of duplicity at the highest levels of government. In nothing else, the Vietnam War intimately exposes its audience to the traumas of war. Rather, viewers of the Burns and Novick saga, Americans in particular, should seek to gain newfound perspectives from this complex story. In short, the film should stimulate new conversation about the war in Vietnam rather than serve to end debate, because two of our nation's finest directors have spoken. This documentary should not become the accepted gospel of Vietnam. And I'm going to put an amen to that. Empathy involves seeing American protesters as more than just spoiled, privileged kids, to considering that the deserter Jack Todd might have been more courageous by heading to Canada than Tim O'Brien, who came close to deserting but ultimately deployed reluctantly to South Vietnam. It forces us to wrestle with uncomfortable proposition voiced by both the American Marine Carl Malantes and the North Vietnamese soldier Nguyen Ngoc, and that there can, in fact, be a savage joy to combat. Obviously, it's from someone who's never been in combat. Of course, seeking perspective from the history does not mean you have to agree with the views of those historical actors or the narrative choices made by Mr. Burns and Ms. Novak. Even as advisor, I left the film feeling the writers had vastly oversimplified American military strategy and unjustly reduced its objectives to the well-worn tropes of attrition and body count. Still, any displeasure with the director's choices should not lead to handy checklist of lessons. Viewers should resist temptation to see the documentary simply as an indictment of those with whom they disagree. Such an approach leads inappropriately to an, if only, formulation of history. Now, I'm going to stop right there and give you an editorial comment. I think that when we talked before the last show, how do you consensus? Because different vets were there at different times, different jobs, different branches of services. And I think it's hard to get a consensus to vets about the war itself because their knowledge is pretty limited in most cases. But the history is history. Facts are facts. You can have your own opinions, but you can't have your own facts. That's off my horse there. Let me get back to this. 18 hours is hardly enough time to fully embrace the complexities of the multiple wars, both home and abroad, that engulfed Southeast Asia and the United States for much of the Cold War era. It's hard to imagine fitting every question into the documentary of any length, let alone every answer. Well, you should say that when you start, that you don't have every answer. So if Americans fail to question some of the deeply held assumptions on what war could achieve for them in the 1960s, perhaps it is not time to do so now. A checklist of lessons won't get us there, but perhaps seeking a sense of historical perspective will. Where do you get the sense of historical perspective and without the checklist? Greg Dedes is an associate professor of history at Chapman University. Now, Dale, let's just go ahead and get you involved here. The organization that you are involved with is trying to get the true stories out there of the Vietnam War. And we've talked quite a bit in the past. And the first of the show, there's always been a lot of misfacts, myths, and downright lies of the Vietnam War and the history of the Vietnam War and the soldiers a little bit. I'm going to turn it over to you and give me. I have the problem with what he talks about making a list of, if you don't, how can you use that as this documentary as a real tool if you don't make a list of where they missed and so forth? It just makes no sense whatsoever. So give us your point of view and your opinions of the documentary, and we'll go from there.
Okay, let me start with something simple in a way. The idea was supposedly to be able to get both sides of an argument of discussions and get learning out of it, and maybe some type of appreciation of each other and some sense of what really did happen or should have happened, could have happened, etc. The truth is that the divide on this piece of history is great enough that there's really no bridging it from the two far ends. If, in fact, you simply understand the policy of containment, which we started in the 1950s after it became clear that communism was taking over large chunks of the world, and we had people like Khrushchev pounding a table in the UN telling the American people he was going to bury us, and you understand that was a really for a long thing, the Cold War, in which communism was stopped in a lot of places, finally by people acting. And the last big place it was stopped was in Korea. And Korea was a draw, but we kept the South free. When you get to Vietnam, the simple argument on one side is, well, we stopped a communist North from taking over a free South in Korea. That's no different than Vietnam. We need to stop a communist North from taking over a free South. It's part of containment. And in fact, if it does take over all of Vietnam, what are the possibilities of dominoes falling? Could Cambodia go communist? Well, come to think of it, it did. Could Laos go communist? Well, it still is. But Thailand didn't go communist, Malaysia didn't go communist, and Singapore didn't go communist. And when I lived in Singapore in 1980, the premier of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, stated very clearly that they were grateful to the United States for basically using up the drive of communism in Southeast Asia, just wearing out all the reserves that existed, so that by the time the war was over, North Vietnam was not going to be invading anybody else, and they were out of good contacts with China, fought a small war with China. So that's one thing. If you believe that the containment made sense, then you have one argument. If you're of a different school, and there are people who are of that school who sit there and say, oh, no, you can't draw a parallel between Korea and Vietnam. That's really different. And it's different because it was a civil war trying to get rid of colonialists. And therefore, none of the stuff about Korea applies. Well, if someone takes that position, there's no way to reconcile that with the position of, no, it's part of containment. You can argue that containment makes more logical sense. You can argue that it wasn't entirely a civil war. You can argue that there wasn't any colonialism anymore. The French were gone, and we were not colonialists. We've been accused of that, but like, we were going to Vietnam for what? The rubber trees and the tin mines? We were buying our rubber from Malaysia. We had plenty of tin from the rest of the world. We didn't need to go to Vietnam for that. It really was part of Kennedy's call to fight every foe and bear every burden in the cause of liberty. So, but again, if that's how you believe, and you're talking to a person who doesn't believe that, you can't cross that ground. You really can't. So you're never going to stop this argument. You can try to be very factual about the actual history, not perceptions, not feelings, just facts, and then figure out what the facts might tell you. And for me, the simplest fact is, well, if you want to know who are the good guys and who are the bad guys, because you see, we'd like to say we were the good guys, but anti-war people say, well, we may have had good intentions, but we wound up being the bad guys because of our stupidity, et cetera, and our bad politics. And we never should have gone there, and we wound up, whether we meant to be the bad guys or not. And there were people who say, and there's nothing against the veterans, but you wound up fighting in the wrong cause. You were the bad guys, whether you meant to be or not. And my comment is, okay, well, the simplest way to think about what a war means is, what happens when the war is over? Are things better or are things worse? Well, after World War II, they weren't shoveling babies into ovens anymore. They weren't burning books. They weren't oppressing people in all kinds of ways. So, and we end up rebuilding Europe, and the Germans are our friends now. So after World War II, things got better. After Korea, put it this way, does anybody here want to move to North Korea? I don't think so. Okay. What happened after Saigon fell? Well, the National Liberation Front, which is supposedly the independent body of nationalists in South Vietnam, had this whole list of what they was going to do when they took over the country, and they were going to heal the rift, and there would be a South Vietnam that would be in association with North Vietnam, but they would still have their own freedoms and things like that. It was a great idea, and great promises, and it didn't work out that way. And in fact, within months of the fall of Saigon, the NLF was dissolved by the communists, and they were told to go away and not bother me anymore. Some of their people wound up in the re-education, and their Minister of Justice, Tran Du Trang, wound up as a boat person and lives in Paris. So that didn't work out well. And in terms of what happened, people argue about whether there were 40,000 executions or 80,000 executions by the communists. But the bottom line is tens of thousands of executions by the communists. Oh, okay. Now, people said there would be no bloodbath after the war was over. I guess you have to get to 1 million people before it's a bloodbath. Apparently 30 or 40,000 doesn't count. Let's see, 1.3 million people went into re-education. 300,000 of them were there for as long as 18 years. They had about a 30% death rate. That doesn't sound like much fun either, okay? Let me see. They imposed Marxist economics on the South, which led to them having the highest natal death rate in all of Southeast Asia and the most malnutrition for 10 years. They had complete oppression, block wardens, secret police, and by the way, they still have some of that. So, you know, it just didn't seem to work out all that nicely. And the fact that something like 2 million Vietnamese got up and left the land of their ancestors in a culture where that's a really big thing tells you that it was not just difficult or unpleasant, it was terrible. Oh, and by the way, interestingly enough, how many people know that of those boat people who left Vietnam, 250,000 were from the north and they went to China as refugees? Does that tell you anything about what life was like under communism? So, bottom line there is you're never going to resolve this because people will ignore all that. Although, let me give some credit. A limited number of anti-war people, a year later, headed by Joan Baez, took out full-page ads in 5 major newspapers in the United States, condemning the oppression and lack of promise-keeping in Vietnam, and called on Hanoi to back off and keep their promises. And they had 2 receptions to this. The reception in Hanoi was an echoing, utter silence. And the reception from the rest of the anti-war movement was terrible personal attacks and condemnation for daring to say anything against the socialist government. So that kind of tells you something about how things really worked out and how devoted some anti-war people are to being anti-war. It becomes a matter of passion for them that at least equals the passion of any veteran who merely served there and saw his friends die. So it's kind of a big deal. Did I cover any of that well enough?
I think you did good on that, Del. You know, everybody talks about how many Vietnamese were killed during the war, but they seem to only on one side. It's the whole, as I mentioned to you before, it was almost like there was only two groups of people fighting the war in Vietnam, was us and the North Vietnamese. The South Vietnamese got very little coverage of what they did in the war, and it wasn't all that good a coverage when it was covered. Yes, there was some problems with the South Vietnamese military because of the young soldiers who were never trained and so forth, who had bad leadership. Well, I tell you, American troops who have bad leadership will do the same thing as the South Vietnamese soldiers did. But once they started training, they accounted for themselves very well, especially after we pulled out. That was kind of looked over during the series. Going back to the original history of the war was kind of changed around a little bit. And
let me address something on that I think is important. In going to the actual Burns documentaries and what was said in there, and first thing I want to register is there is some excellent work done in the Burns series. There are some very good points made. There's some good history in there, okay? The frustration is that there's also a lot of stuff which ranges from false to inaccurate and some horrendous omissions that are really important to understanding things. And what you just alluded to, one of the people there, in fact, there was a Vietnamese refugee living in this country who was very bitter about the war. And oddly enough, was of the two Vietnamese refugees living here, they found two people in all of Southern California who have nothing good whatsoever to say about the ARVN or the Americans or the government in Saigon, which is kind of interesting considering that there's at least 400,000 South Vietnamese living in California, of whom 99.8% would have different opinions than that. But what the woman said was, how could we expect anything to ever get better in South Vietnam because nothing ever changed? It was the same people. There's this tiny little detail called Tet 1968, which had a profound effect, well, had many profound effects, but had a profound effect in South Vietnam. Up until then, there had been a lot of people who were kind of on the fence about the war, a lot of people who were kind of fellow travelers and sympathetic to the VC and the idea of maybe coming under Ho's rule, etc. And after Tet and the massacres, the huge massacres in Hue, everything changed. The ARVN did not have to draft anyone the rest of that year because so many young men volunteered to join. Okay. No monk ever burned himself again after Tet 68 until 75, when they started burning themselves in protest of the communists, which nobody noticed at all. And in fact, far more Vietnamese Buddhists burned themselves to death after Saigon fell than before, but nobody knows that either. But the bottom line was everything changed in the minds of the South Vietnamese, and with Mr. Nixon, everything changed with Vietnamization. So that in the mid-60s, early 60s, you might have said in the ARVN, 20% good units, 40% medium, and 40% bad. By the time we left in 1971, it was like 80% excellent, 80% good, and 20% fairly good. And even the regional and popular forces, these were the village people who were armed by us. The Vietnamese government giving arms to the people in the villages. That tells you something, because in the 60s, they couldn't have done that. The arms would have gone to the VC. They gave the arms to people in the villages, and they were fighting, okay? So that by the time the Easter invasion came in 1972, which was 200,000 men in something like 12 divisions with 400 tanks, more tanks than all the tanks of the ARVN, and several hundred artillery pieces, all of which much better than anything ARVN had, and enough AA to shoot down the ARVN Air Force. We weren't there. And bigger battles went on than any we were in, and the ARVN inflicted 40% casualties on the invading force. And those shattered divisions left, dragging their wounded with them and leaving behind their tanks and artillery because they were smashed so badly. We weren't there. In a sense, we had accomplished our goal of getting South Vietnam to be able to take care of itself, which in a sense was the major victory. Of course, all we had to do was this little detail of keep our promises and keep supplying them, and that didn't quite work out. So that's something that was said there, in which this woman said nothing had changed, was absolutely false. There were two other things that were said that were false. One main thing. When it started, they talked about the promised elections and implied that they had been reneged on by the American government and South Vietnam. Anyone can go to the internet and download the Geneva Accords and the secondary document called the Final Declaration. Anybody can look at those and see what they say.
And nobody signed them.
Well, two people signed the Accords,
yeah.
The French general and the representative of the Viet Minh. And in that one, it was just between them. It was free elections were mentioned, okay? but that one was signed by them. The final declaration was much more specific, calling for UN supervised private, that is, elections on your secret ballot. Okay, nobody signed that because Ho was not about to sign anything for UN supervised secret elections or secret ballot elections. Secret ballot elections were not a tradition in communist countries. They still aren't, as a matter of fact. Okay, and when you look at the election results in places like Cuba, et cetera, and you see numbers like 99.8% all the time. Wow, isn't that fantastic? Must be great marketing. No, it's not great marketing. It's that you vote the way you're told to vote. So there was no legal obligation whatsoever on the Godinsiam to accept elections demanded by Ho, because Ho was not demanding elections according to the final declaration. He was demanding elections under his control. Well, under his control means you get the 99.8%. And since the population of the North was greater than the population of the South, those kind of elections would be suicide for the South. So the United States did not tell Diem not to have elections. They didn't have to tell Diem anything about not having elections. He was much too smart a guy to go for that. So that was very misleading.
Well, you know, he was made out in the documentary. He was made out as a bad guy, and Ho was Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh was put out as a benevolent to his people. Wasn't a communist. He was a nationalist. But that man had been involved in the communist movements for 30 or 40 years before this time, and was about as locked in a communist you could be. But the documentary came across this, Uncle Ho was looking after his people and so forth, and there was nothing farther from the truth. He was a true communist and doing everything that the communists do along these lines. So.
Well, there was at least some part of the truthful stuff. There was at least some allusion to his being communist, and one of the North Vietnamese actually said, "Well, after all, he just grew the beard to look older as part of his propaganda," which I thought was interesting. And that guy is probably in really hot water about now. In fact, I belong to a group of academics. Well, I'm not an academic that study Vietnam, and it turns out that some of the men in North Vietnam who appeared in the series have been mildly unappreciated by the government for some of the stuff they said.
I would imagine the guy had talked about the atrocities of Hue, all the people that was killed by the North Vietnamese. I have a feeling he's not exactly the most popular person in North Vietnam with the political bureau.
Probably not, but they did. Now they also played little games like Ho wasn't there when Vo Ninh Giap wiped out the nationalists and the Trotskyites. Just he wasn't there for that. Sure, because Giap would have done stuff against Ho's will, not in a million years. Okay, so Ho he's presented. You get the impression of his benevolence, but at least there is some mention. I want to give credit where credit is due. There's some mention of the fact that he really was a communist more than a nationalist. And actually, the final thing was when he died, in his last statement, he said he was looking forward in the next afterlife to meeting Lenin and Marx. He wasn't looking forward to meeting Phan Bo Choi or any of the famous nationalists who had fought, lived, and died for independence. He was looking forward to meeting Lenin and Marx. That's pretty telling. When a guy's about to die and he tells you who he wants to see in heaven, you know where he's coming from. So that's kind of important. But there wasn't that much that was false. There were this substantial omissions. One of the ones that really got me was, of course, they had to play the two famous pictures that are the biggest things from the war. And the General Luan shooting the guy in the head. It's like, this is terrible, this is horrible, et cetera, et cetera. And they provided how much background to that? Zero. What's the background to that? Well, they called him Hap Long. He had actually a different name in Vietnamese. He had been the head of a murder squad and had personally partaken in the slaughter of Vietnamese officers, a colonel, his wife, and their children.
Yeah, this was the man who got shot we're talking about.
The man who got shot. So he had personally been involved in an atrocity, massacring an entire family down to small children, and was boasting about it. Under the laws of war, and a non-uniformed person committing atrocities can be executed. So General Luan did something very dramatic, but in the middle of a battle, he was actually quite justified, and people need to understand that. They may decide he shouldn't have done that, but it's very, very different when you understand that he wasn't shooting some guy they picked up on the street for carrying a VC flag. It wasn't one of those deals at all, okay? That was kind of an important omission. What are some other ones? Let me think. There's all this coverage about the VC who remained in the South after the partition. Little detail, and who were passionately in favor of Ho and passionately against Saigon. Little detail. The Geneva Accords called for all of them to go north. And roughly 50,000 did not go north because they were instructed to stay behind as sleeper cells, okay? But we heard about their patriotism and their hatred of the colonialists and their hatred of the Saigon government. Let's see, something close to 900,000 Vietnamese left the north to go to the south to escape communism. We didn't hear any of them interviewed about how much they hated communism and how they fought against it and how they loved the Saigon government and what terrible times they went through before they became boat people. We didn't hear any of that. So where's the balance in this presentation? If somebody says that Burns tried to be balanced, and I do not doubt that Mr. Burns, in his mind, may really have thought he was trying to be balanced. Who were his two chief advisors? A guy named Vallely, former Marine, and a guy named McPeak, former Air Force. There's two chief advisors, both of whom were members of the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. Well, wait a second. If your two chief advisors are from the 1% of 1% of Vietnam veterans who were against the war, do you think that might have led to something about how you put the series together? That's kind of like not what you call balance. During the interviews, they interviewed 6 or more communist veterans who got a lot of talking time. One of whom, by the way, was VC, talked with joy about taking a village man out into the rice paddies at night and hacking him to death with machetes. Oh, that was okay, apparently, all right? They interviewed 3 ARVN veterans who got very little time. That's balance? Of the 24 American veterans interviewed, 9 were anti-war. That's more than a third of the people that were interviewed, and they got more time than anybody else. Caputo and Marlantes got more time than anybody else, and they're anti-war guys, okay? So that's not exactly balance.
The whole concept, the whole way through, it's like they were trying to get across that we shouldn't have been there to start with, and we didn't do, we were the bad guys. That was almost the whole concept of the documentary to me. They kept going, well, we shouldn't have been there. We shouldn't have been there. We couldn't win the war. The war wasn't winnable. The war was winnable. We were, when we quit supporting the South Vietnamese military, had no effect whatsoever on the support that the North Vietnamese were getting from Russia and China.
Actually, it did have an effect. Their support increased.
Their support increased, yes. So that's, to me, the whole concept was putting us down, and the idea of we were trying to save the people from communism was defective in to start with. You and I both have a lot of friends here that were former South Vietnamese military and a lot of people who are now Vietnamese Americans, and they all appreciate what we have done. You would think that they would be upset because we basically walked off and left them. But they understand, they have better knowledge of communism. I would like for some of those South Vietnamese people who were experienced communists, to be able to go into schools today and talk about what really communism is all about. And I think it might even wake up a few people out there who don't seem to know what exactly they're talking about along those lines. You want to?
Very true. It's unfortunate that there is enough of a slant, enough imbalance, enough omissions in the series to really have an ultimately negative effect, and give people the impression, the strong impression, that the war was unwinnable and we were foolish to go there, and the communists were right, and the Saigon government was hopeless, and the South Vietnamese could never fight it. All those things are implied in there or stated in there, and they're just not valid. They're just not true. And as I said, what you see at the end of the war tells you more. It tells you as much as you're ever going to need to know about that. By the way, one of the other things was the guy that they had talking, the anti-war expert that was there, whose name escapes me at the moment. Turns out this is his lifetime. This has been his entire lifetime. Okay. He also worked for Tom Hayden as a counselor. Even he mentions that at times the anti-war movement got excessive. Well, that's really nice, but the big emphasis is that, after all, there were so many truly nice, sincere people in the anti-war movement. Well, actually, I knew a lot of them, and there were many truly nice, sincere anti-war people in the movement, okay? They weren't the ones running it, by and large. And what never gets mentioned are that the upper level people did things like go to Paris to meet with the woman who represented the VC in Paris and take their orders from her, which they said when they came back, we went to Paris and talked to Madame, whatever her name was, and got our orders. They said that, okay?
So one of them ran for president.
That's another story. But
okay, we'll go. Well,
we'll leave that one. So there, you know, it's people have to understand that the anti-war movement, there were big chunks of people in it who were just against war and against killing and let's bring peace and safety, et cetera, et cetera. But the people at the top, they weren't anti-war. They were pro-Hanoi. They weren't against the war happening. They were for Hanoi winning it. And you'll notice in some of the backgrounds of the demonstrations that they show in the Burn series, there are people flying VC flags. That's not subtle, okay? So however many good people were involved in anti-war, the people running it really had an agenda that was pro-Hanoi and anti-American, and that's important to understand.
Well, I think one of the things they should have brought out also with the war protesters is the group, the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, did have a meeting of their leaders there, and they discussed assassinating some United States senators. That was part of the protest that I think really should have been brought out also. It's like the protesters were better than the soldiers who went and served their country. They were serving their country more, and I really, in my own opinion, the war protesters prolonged the war quite a bit and caused a lot of American soldiers to die in the process. I think that should have been discussed as part of the documentary also, that yes, there were some sincere people out there, but a lot of people were there just because it was a good place to, as the mantra was back then, make love, not war, and all the drugs. So if you were a young single guy or whatever, that was the place to be. I had nothing to do with the war.
Well, one of the things about being anti-war is that, again, as an American who believes in freedom of thought, I am not going to deny somebody the right to take issue with the war, okay? And if you're sincere and you really don't want to go, and you say, I'm not going, send me to jail, okay, I'll respect that. You're living out your actual beliefs. If you say, I don't believe in war, but I will be a medic and serve, which some people did, I have profound respect for them, okay? One of the greatest heroes of World War II, they just made a movie about him called Hacksaw Ridge. Mm-hmm. Guy who refused to carry a gun, was totally anti-war, but served his country and saved a lot of lives. Boy, you can't fault that, okay? There were alternate services you could take. There were a number of things you could do besides going to Canada and going to Sweden, Okay. So the people who decided that their only thing to do was to go to Sweden or go to Canada and have a great time, I'm not as happy with that. And to be honest, I really was unhappy with the final amnesty that Jimmy Carter gave out, in which everybody could come back no matter what they had done. And I really thought that was a very, very bad thing. Again, the people are sincerely anti-war and live out their ideals as rigorously as they can and try everything possible to avoid being involved in something they don't believe in. Don't have any trouble for that. The people who said, what, me go get shot at? No, not me. My answer is, well, go to Canada or Sweden. And by the way, have a nice life there. Don't come back. Okay. But some people say that's too harsh. I'm sorry. I'm just a nasty old guy.
Well, I have read and studied a little bit that once they went from the draft to the lottery, a lot of the war protesters went away. Because a lot of the war protesters were protesting the war. It was, I don't want my butt in Vietnam. And when they went to the lottery, and after the first few days of pulling out the numbers, and you knew your birthday was 360, a lot of those war protesters no longer were war protesters.
Once the universal draft stopped, the campus activities died down rather substantially. It's not that they stopped altogether, but they died down a lot. And the people left protesting after that were more the hardcore. They were the guys flying the VC flags.
And the thing about, there's such a controversy about the Vietnam veterans when we came home and how we were treated. And they also go out there and say that the story about Vietnam veterans being spit on and attacked and urine thrown at them was a myth. And I'm not certain exactly where they get that idea from, because when you came home from Vietnam, you couldn't hardly even tell anybody you were a Vietnam veteran. And they told me when I came home that I needed to take my uniform off and not even wear it coming home because of these war protesters. But now they come back and say that never happened.
That's a popular, a myth of myths. A professor at my old college wrote a book some years ago called The Spitting Image, in which he maintained that he could find no record of veterans ever being treated badly or being spit on, which was interesting because within 2 years of publishing the book, others rebutted him with detailed accounts from newspapers of exactly those events. Hasn't stopped the guy. He just wrote a column in the New York Times saying the exact same thing 20 years later, even though he's been rebutted. Now, was everybody spit on? No. Was everybody treated really badly at airports? No. Were some people? Absolutely yes. No two ways about it. And whether it was one guy in 10 or one guy in 100 doesn't matter, because we all knew about it. And we all knew that we were not popular and people did not want to talk to us. I walked onto the campus of the University of Maryland wearing my uniform, and a crowd of students kind of came around me looking very unhappy. And a bunch of veterans came out of the Veterans Center and rescued me and took me to the Veterans Center and said, don't ever come on campus again in uniform. That was 1969, okay? Actually, that was December 1968, to be precise. When I got my first job, I only got it because one of my classmates was second in charge of the personnel department and overcame the objections there to hiring a Vietnam veteran with a beard, because those guys are dangerous, okay? It's kind of interesting. So we weren't all treated like dirt. Some of us were. We all were not treated exactly the way the guys coming back from World War II were. And by the way, the good news is that the guys coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan get treated much, much better, in large part because of the discussions we've had in the years since. And I've had Iraqi and Afghan vets thank me for our activities, which made things better for them.
One of the things that got me about the documentary, Dale, is before it actually came out, when Burns and Novick were doing interviews, they talked about they had so much materials to work with. They had to make a decision of what to leave out and what to add to it. And again, I think it goes back to the advisors. Just how was the decision made of what was to leave out that is the same thing as a lie by omission. As far as I'm concerned, is telling a story. If it took 20 hours instead of 18 hours or 25 or 40 hours to tell the real story, if you're going to tell the real story, some of that stuff could have been left out, but the peripheral stuff, but tell the real story, the whole story. How do you decide if you were not involved in a war and all you had was people who were against the war who had their own agendas or mindsets? How did they decide what was worth taking out and what was worth putting in? That had been an interesting conversation to do that.
Well, ideally, you would have people who are really objective doing these things. And unfortunately, it's very clear, especially given the advisors that he had as chief advisors, that there was a definite lack of objectivity. I want to give them credit for the stuff that they did get some stuff right. It's just that, unfortunately, as a friend of mine said, it's like somebody gives you a delicious piece of cake, but when they made the cake, they mixed sand into the batter. And every now and then as you're chewing, your teeth start grinding, okay? And it's that kind of a thing watching it. It really is unfortunate. And by the way, to be fair, could you cover the war in 18 hours? No. Get serious. You couldn't cover the war in 100 hours, okay? But could you do a better balanced job? Yes, you could. And that's what's so frustrating, that I think this series, with comparatively minor adjustments, could have been really worthwhile. When we knew Burns was making it and we heard some of the comments from him, we knew it would be slanted at least a little. But what we hoped at VVFH was that, well, if it's a little slant, it won't matter so much and people still get a benefit out of it. You know, it's one of these things like if the floor isn't flat, but there's a 5-degree slant to the floor, it's okay, you can still walk. Unfortunately, this slant is a lot more than 5 degrees, and it's tough walking for some of us. And by the way, if anybody really wants to see a lot of the reviews about this, they've been collected by the Vietnam Veterans for Factual History. If you go to vvfh.org and start looking around the website, you'll come across the wiki part of it that's got, at last, I think we had 15 or 16 really good reviews on there, some of which were just absolutely outstanding in terms of being historical. Now, some of the reviews are by veterans who have their emotions in it, which we try to avoid because the whole term is factual, okay? And I try to be factual here today. But there are some reviews that are extremely factual, very good history, and if anybody's really interested, I recommend you take a look.
You have you have another website. It's facts. What's the website about the facts of Vietnam? Or is that the same one?
It's on there. Yeah, it's all in there. Yeah.
I think that's a good website to go because they do have a lot of the myths answered there. They list the myths and give you the factual information and so forth for it. And y'all are doing it quite a bit now to overcome some of the misinformation with your organization. It's going with y'all not just sitting back doing it. You're out there with press releases and other things to get it out there. As I mentioned before, one of the biggest concerns, I was excited about this thing when it came out, and then when I started watching, I'm going, oh my God, because there has been so much misfacts out there that I was looking forward, because we have worked so many years in the schools, talking to the students and trying to dispel some of the myths and so forth. And I was looking forward to this documentary to give us the support and background that we need when we go into schools, but it missed that point as far as I'm concerned. So I think your organization is going to help quite a bit, and hopefully we can get the word out that if a teacher is teaching the lessons of Vietnam or about a Vietnam course, even if it's just a couple of days, they're able to go to the website and get the information. If they're going to show the documentary, it's almost like they need to go to that website and get the information from there. So and let the students watch the documentary and then discuss it, the documentary and what you have on your website, I think that would be a very educational situation to see the two and compare and come to their own conclusions and so forth. What's
Yeah, looking at things in a broad sense and seeing, rights and lefts or ups and downs, whatever, and then figuring out what makes the most sense to you, what really seems factual, and what's not factual, is important. The problem with some really good arguments is that if they're very smoothly presented, you're not an expert in the area, you walk away saying, "Oh, well, that makes sense to me. That sounds really great." Okay, and Mr. Burns and Ms. Novick are great filmmakers. They've made something which, if you don't know anything and you watch it, it's very well put together. It's very, very smooth, great images. Oh, speaking of images, just let me mention in passing, episode 7, 29 minutes into it, they're talking about the Marine Valerie who got an award for being in a firefight in 1969. And if you go to 29 minutes in episode 7, you'll see the movies of a firefight, a bunch of Marines firing machine guns, people running around, wounded people, bodies on the ground. And I looked at that and I said, that wasn't 1969. That firefight was in 1968. How do I know that? Because I'm the guy who filmed it. And they left out a couple of things. At the tail end of it, there's a quick shot of a little Vietnamese boy lying dead on the ground. Very sad, tragic situation. That's all they show. And they don't say anything. They just show this little Vietnamese boy dead on the ground. What they don't show is the rest of the film, the 4 VC and NVA adults dead around him, fully equipped with AK-47s, bandoliers, and everything else. They had taken that boy from the village for some reason or another. It was a night ambush by the Marines in which you can't see who's out there. You just know they're the other guys. And the poor boy was a victim of the war. But he wasn't shot by Americans because he was a little boy. He was just caught in a crossfire. And if there's any responsibility for his death, it's for those 4 adults. Well, actually, there were more than 4. Some got away. It's for the adult communists who took him out of his village to take them with him in the middle of the night to go someplace. But you don't know that if you just look at the picture.
Now, let me ask you, cover this a little bit. We talked about the people in Burns that used for advisors and so forth. They had their own slant. When you're out there trying to show the truths, how do y'all overcome some of the people in your group who have their own slant?
Well, I'm kind of the gatekeeper. That's why they made me the secretary, so to speak. You can't go to a war and not come back with effects and marks and feelings. That's perfectly natural, okay? I have, in a sense, the advantage of having been trained in the old-fashioned way by the Jesuits, in which there was a lot of discussion of self-reflection, looking for objectivity, and then being trained as a scientist, where you really try to look for objectivity. It's like the old Dragnet thing, just the facts, man. I have my feelings, but I try to deal with them. When I first heard about My Lai, I did not want to believe it, okay? But I looked into it, and it was like, oh, damn, that's real. That happened. That was shameful. That was horrible. There's no excuse. It's awful. That's all there is to it, okay? And you have to work at that. Working at objectivity is a full-time job, and I spend a lot of time at it, maybe because of being a scientist and everything else. But, it's just the best you can do. And we try to hold people down. It's like in a lot of things. When people talk about a president, whether it's Mr. Trump or Mr. Obama, and they come up with things about them that they think are very negative, I try to look at them like, wait a second, take the emotion out of it. What are the facts? What did they really say? What did they really do? Is this a justified criticism? If they say something super positive, I look, is it really super positive, or is it not? It's trying to find the truth, which is a difficult thing. But if you, none of us can achieve total objectivity. That's not a human thing. But we can get a lot closer if we think about it and work at it and try it. and really try to focus as much as we can. And being aware of your own biases and trying to take them into account is what's really important. Sadly, there's a lot of people who are very nice people, very passionate, and they're very, very biased, but they're so passionate that they don't see it as a bias. It's just that's the world that they see. And there have been times I've been in discussions or actually debates with anti-war people, and I'm trying to be factual and not get emotional, and I'll bring up facts that they don't like, and they get angry. They get very angry. And I'm trying to not get angry. Why are they angry? They're angry because they don't have a good answer, but they know in their hearts what's right, and I must be wrong. So that I'm saying these things they can't answer, just their response is to get angry and sometimes start screaming. But it's a tough question, and that's why we've got several of us in the group who review what goes on the website and try to make sure that there's as much solid factual history and the kind of things that have references. It's like, you don't have to believe me. Here's the reference. Here's what the guy said in the book, A Vietnam Memoir. Here's what Jop said at one point in time. Here's what Le Duan said at one point in time. Le Duan's best quote, by the way, was after Congress cut back on the aid to South Vietnam and forbade the use of any more air power there, he made a speech in the Politburo in which he said, the Americans will not come back now, even if we offer them candy. That's his quote. That's what he said, okay? So you don't have to believe me about his attitudes. You can believe what he said about his attitudes. And that's what you try to go for, is the facts, just the facts. When people make excuses for Jane Fonda, well, she was a young girl and da-da-da, she didn't know. I said, well, that's great. Try to remember that when the POWs came back and started explaining what happened to them, she called them hypocrites and liars about their torture. That's a fact. That's what she said, and that's the way she said it. Okay, so all this thing about her being innocent and being duped by Tom Hayden, et cetera, no, that's what she said. That's how she said it. We remember that. We have to remember that.
That was a question I wanted to answer that I was looking for, because I want people to be able to go to your website and look at the burns and realize that y'all have tried everything you could to overcome your individual biases on the information you had, and you tried to rely on the facts, and you've actually been able to back up what you state as facts. Facts are facts, and not everybody's can't have their own facts. I mean, facts are just what they are as facts. So if you go out there, and I would recommend you all go to this website and pull up the information and look at it and compare that to what you remember about the documentary. It will be shown many times again. So you can take it and the website and sit down with the computer and during the next time they show it and look at the website of this organization and compare it to what the documentary is about. And you're going into, I think you'll look at the documentary a completely different way. And I think you'll learn by using the documentary and their website that Dale's working on, and give you a better looking and better adjustment of what the war was all about and so forth. So, Dale, I appreciate you coming in tonight and getting out there and so forth. It sounds like we have a caller or somebody coming in. All right, who we got? Hello, you there?
Yeah. Are they still taking questions or not?
Yes, sir. I've been waiting for you.
Okay.
What's your question?
Well, I think RJ, and Bill did a great job tonight. I was on Bill's show back in June of last year. And one of my questions is, when I was watching the documentary, I totally agree with RJ. Nobody's looking at the facts. I was in artillery. They didn't show anything about artillery. They pointed the whole documentary was about how great the North Vietnamese was. They wanted to colonize, get the people out, the French. They wanted the Americans out. all that stuff. How do we as veterans, when we know the facts, how do we tell that story when we see other people come against us? Because I was one of the guys that I couldn't find a job when I came home. I didn't talk about the war, but the documentary is not showing the true facts of everything that was going on. It gives us a different picture. So how do we tell the story that RJ is really talking about?
Is this Jerry?
Yep.
Jerry,
This is Jerry,
appreciate
Bill.
you calling in. Can you answer that,
Yep.
Dale?
Well, it's an uphill battle. I mean, people, a lot of the vets I know, because I've been on this thing nonstop ever since the series started. Okay, I mean, I was on it for 4 hours on the internet today, getting stuff organized and talking about things. And a lot of vets have written letters to their papers, and the letters don't get published. Okay, a lot of people have written to PBS, and nothing comes back. So the problem is that it's a real uphill battle because a lot of the media and academia, they don't want to hear from us. You can tell your friends and neighbors. That's why we organized VVFH, so we could put a bunch of us together and maybe have a chance to get stuff done better and to get the website going. All I can tell you is take a look at the website and maybe decide if you want to join us just as an associate member or something to get the emails. And you can find the resources there of the other great reviews and the resources on history that you can use if you ever get a chance to talk to other people. We're all in the checkout line here. Okay, we don't have that much time, so we need to say as much as we can to as many as we can if they'll listen. I hate to say it's a really steep uphill fight, but it is. We're just doing the best we can because we owe it. We owe it to the guys who didn't come back, and we owe it to the American people to try to get the truth out.
Dale, give me that. Give us real slow the website. It's
VVFH, Victor Fox Hotel at
.com
.org.
.org.
ORG. Yep.
All right. Appreciate you calling in, Jerry. We got somebody else now. Thank you, Jerry.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. Appreciate it.
Okay, come on, caller. You got a question, comment? Oh, okay. I thought it rang again. Well, Jerry, appreciate you listening again tonight, and hope it gave you some ammunition to get out there. As Dale mentioned earlier, some people are so set in their ways is you could beat them to death with the facts, and they're just not going to change their mind. It's their preconceived idea, and that's what it is because that's what they decided, and just all the facts just not going to sway one way or the other. The best thing those people is just leave them alone. Go ahead.
One last bit of humor that people may appreciate. There are a number of people on the left who have written scathing reviews of Burns because it doesn't glorify the anti-war people enough. And it doesn't condemn the United States enough. We actually have one on the VVFH website just so people can see it. There's a professor whose name is Christopher Appy. He's up in Massachusetts, who is, if there were Olympic medals in twisting the reality around, he'd be at least a silver, maybe a gold. I'm not sure. But there are people out there that are really unhappy because the series is far too kind to the United States and far too kind to American soldiers and way not nearly nice enough to the people, the anti-war people who were the wonderful people who brought liberation and justice to the South and the great heroes like Ho Chi Minh. I read these things and I'm like, wow, it's really, but it's nice to know that they're out there and they're mad too.
What world is he living in? Well, when this first case, the announcement that first coming out about this documentary and so forth, a lot of that group wanted equal time. They wanted to have equal time given their side of the view. They didn't feel like the documentary was going to cover their side, and from what I saw, it covered their side very well. But again, that's my own perspective, and we all have our own perspective and our own thoughts. But again, thank you for tuning in tonight. Thank you for being here, Dale. And we'll be back in 2 weeks, and we'll continue on with our show. Hope you have a great Veterans Day out there. There's a lot of different things going on for Veterans Day, wherever you are. Whatever you do, whatever you're doing, take a moment and think about the veterans who are serving today and their families, as well as us older folks out there who put their life on the line, put their lives on hold so that we can all be free. Because I tell you what, there's nothing better than freedom. If you don't think so, live in a cage or go to a communist country and stay for a little while. But the veterans are what gave us our freedom. And thank a veteran and take him to lunch or her to lunch. Y'all have a good evening and a good Veterans Day weekend. Thank you.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. If you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section at nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by Telestream's Wirecast software, StreamingGear.com, Carolina Apparel, and DeltaForce.net.